Her betrothed's letter lay open in her lap, the ink still fresh enough to smear beneath her thumb, and Margaret Ellery read the words a third time as though repetition might change what they plainly said. That Everett Bligh had married her cousin Louisa 2 weeks past, in the very chapel he'd promised to marry Margaret and himself, and that he was sorry, truly sorry, but Louisa had simply seemed the better match once she'd arrived from the east ahead of Margaret's own delayed train. She sat on the single hard bench at the far junction depot with that letter and $11, and a trunk containing the whole of what remained of her old life. 1,000 miles from the Boston rooming house she'd given up, from the mother who'd wept to see her go, from every certainty she'd carried west believing herself a bride and arriving, instead to find herself nothing at all. She had known Everett Bligh since they were children, had corresponded with him faithfully for 2 years while he established himself out west, had turned down 2 other suitable offers of marriage in Boston because her heart, and her promise, belonged already to him. She had sold her mother's second-best silver to afford this journey, believing it the last expense of her old, unmarried life before a new one began, and now she sat with that silver gone and that life unraveled and no new one waiting to replace it, and could not, for a long while, make herself move from the bench at all. The depot agent had already told her, not unkindly but without much comfort in it either, that the next eastbound train wasn't through for 4 days, and that her $11 wouldn't cover the fare regardless of when it came. "Ma'am," a man's voice, low and careful, as though he'd already guessed he was intruding on something raw. "You've been sitting there near 2 hours without moving. Is there someone I can send word to?" Margaret looked up into a weathered, sun-browned face beneath a battered hat, a rancher by the look of his boots and the dust on his coat, watching her with an open concern that undid something in her composure she'd been holding together by main force since she'd read Everett's letter. "There's no one to send word to," she said, and heard her own voice crack on it. "I came west to marry a man who's already married my cousin instead, and I haven't the fare to go home, and I haven't got a home left to go to besides since I gave up my rooms to come out here and be a wife." She pressed her lips together, mortified at how much of her situation she'd just handed a total stranger. "Forgive me. You didn't ask for the whole accounting." "Didn't mind hearing it," the man said. "Name's Wyatt Denholm. Got a spread 20 miles north of here." He crouched down to her eye level, an oddly gentle gesture from so large a man, and something in the plainness of his manner made her trust him before she'd decided to. "You got any people at all in the territory? Anyone this side of the country you could turn to?" "No one," Margaret admitted. "I know exactly one soul in 1,000 miles, and he's the man who just jilted me for my own cousin." Wyatt was quiet a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Well, I won't pretend that's not a hard spot to be in, but I'll tell you what I can offer plain, and you can take it or leave it as you see fit, no offense taken either way. I've got a wagon here to collect supplies, headed back to my place this afternoon. You're welcome to ride along, get out of this depot and someplace with a roof and a fire while you work out what you mean to do next. My housekeeper's got room, and I'm not a man who expects anything of a woman in trouble beyond her own good sense to accept a kindness when it's offered honest." Margaret studied him, this stranger offering shelter to a woman he'd known 10 minutes, and found herself weighing the offer against every warning her mother had ever given her about trusting strange men in strange places. But there was something in his face, some plain steadiness that reminded her, oddly, of her own father before he died, and she was tired and frightened, and the alternative was 4 more days on a hard bench with $11 and no plan at all. "I'd be grateful," she said finally. "For the ride, at least. I can't promise I know what comes after that." "Nobody's asking you to know that yet," Wyatt said, and reached for her trunk before she could protest the liberty, hefting it easily onto his shoulder. "Wagon's this way, Miss Ellery." The ride out to his ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and Margaret spent much of it in a silence Wyatt seemed content to let stand, offering only the occasional plain observation about the land they passed: "Good grazing here, poor water there. A creek that ran dry most summers but had held all season this year, that asked nothing of her in return, and yet somehow made the miles pass gentler than she'd expected. She found herself, somewhere past the halfway mark, studying his profile against the darkening sky and thinking that here was a man entirely unlike Everett Bligh in every particular she could name. Unhurried where Everett had always been eager to impress, plain-spoken where Everett had specialized in pretty phrases that she understood now, with the bitter clarity of hindsight, had cost him nothing to say and meant less. She did not examine too closely why the comparison occurred to her at all, so soon after the wreck of one engagement, but she noted it regardless, tucked away like a small, unexpected discovery. By the time his ranch house came into view, low and sturdy against the darkening sky, she found she'd stopped bracing herself quite so hard against whatever came next. His housekeeper, a broad, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Purnell, took Margaret's situation in with a single assessing glance and set about feeding her supper without a single question asked. And Margaret, eating a hot meal for the first time since the terrible letter had found her, felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized was clenched so tight. She stayed a week at Wyatt Denholm's ranch, meaning at first only to gather her wits and decide what came next, and found the days settling into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings helping Mrs. Purnell in the kitchen because idleness sat worse on her than work did, afternoons walking the near pastures to clear her head, evenings on the porch where Wyatt, home from his ranch work, would sit a respectful distance away and talk of small things until the worst of her grief had worn its rawest edge away. She wept some nights into the pillow of the small spare room Mrs. Purnell had made up for her, grieving not so much Everett Bligh himself, she came to realize, as the future she had built so carefully in her own mind and now had to dismantle piece by piece. The house she had imagined keeping, the children she had pictured raising, the whole tidy shape of a life that had existed, she understood now, only on paper and in her own hopeful imagining. Mrs. Purnell, catching her red-eyed more than once over the washing, never pried, only pressed an extra cup of tea into her hands and let her be. And Margaret found herself grateful beyond words for a household that offered comfort without demanding, she explained herself. It was on the fourth evening that Wyatt first made her laugh, recounting with dry, unhurried humor the tale of a particularly stubborn bull that had taken a dislike to his best saddle horse and chased the poor animal clear through the henhouse, scattering feathers and indignant hens the length of the yard. And Margaret, listening, felt something in her chest lift for the first time since the letter had found her, a small, surprised lightness she had not expected to feel again so soon. "You don't ask me about Everett," she said one such evening, the same observation she'd made of his silence at the depot, curious now what lay behind it. "Figured a woman jilted the way you were has had quite enough of other folks' opinions on the matter already," Wyatt said. "Reckon the whole territory back east is buzzing with it by now, everybody with something to say about what you ought to have seen coming or done different. Didn't seem to me you needed one more voice adding to that pile." "You're a strange sort of kind, Mr. Denholm. My mother always said I was more comfortable with cattle than people," he said, and there was a wry warmth in it that made her smile despite herself, the first real smile she'd managed in a week. "Cattle don't require much conversation, just feed and water and a fence that holds. And people require considerably more patience," he said, "and I find I've got more of that to spare than most folks credit me with on account of the cattle." By the second week, Margaret had written to her mother explaining the whole disaster and requesting whatever funds could be spared for her return fare, and had begun, in the meantime, to make herself genuinely useful around the ranch in ways that went beyond mere gratitude for shelter mending Wyatt's shirts, for she was a fine needlewoman, and it eased Mrs. Purnell's load considerably, keeping the ranch accounts in a neater hand than the ledger had previously seen, and finding, to her own surprise, a real satisfaction in the plain, unglamorous work of a household that needed her. It was Wyatt's aunt, visiting from the county seat, who first said aloud what Margaret had begun, uneasily, to suspect herself. "You watch that man," the aunt told her over tea, nodding toward the window where Wyatt stood in the yard. "Same way he watches you when he thinks nobody's looking. I've known Wyatt Denholm since he was a boy, Miss Ellery, and I've never once seen him look at a woman the particular way he looks at you." Margaret felt her face heat, and busied herself with her teacup rather than answer directly, though the words lodged themselves somewhere she couldn't easily dislodge them again. She found herself, in the days that followed, noticing things about Wyatt she was fairly certain she had no business noticing in a woman not yet 3 weeks free of one broken engagement. The unhurried patience he showed a green colt he was gentling in the corral, the way he always seemed to know, without being told, when Mrs. Purnell's arthritis was troubling her, and quietly took over the heavier kitchen work himself, the plain, steady kindness with which he treated every soul on his ranch, from the greenest hand to the oldest, without ever once raising his voice to any of them. It was, she thought, an entirely different manner of being courted than Everett's rehearsed compliments had ever managed, though Wyatt had not, in 3 weeks, made a single overture that could rightly be called courting at all. That evening, when her mother's reply finally arrived by the delayed post, bringing with it enough for train fare and a carefully worded suggestion that Margaret come home at once and put the whole humiliating episode behind her, Margaret sat with the letter a long while on the porch steps, watching the sun go down gold and orange over pastures that had, somehow, in 3 short weeks, come to feel less foreign than she would ever have believed possible. Wyatt found her there at dusk, the letter still in her hand. "Fare's come through, then," he said, and something careful entered his voice, a bracing she recognized because she'd felt it in her own chest all afternoon. "It has." She looked up at him. "My mother wants me home directly, says there's nothing left for me out here worth staying for, and I ought to come put Everett Bligh and this whole territory behind me for good." "Is that what you believe, too?" Margaret considered the question with more honesty than she'd given herself credit for having left in her. 3 weeks ago, I'd have said yes without hesitating. I came west believing my whole future was fixed to one man's promise, and when that promise broke, I thought there was nothing left of me to salvage, nothing left worth staying anywhere for. She looked out over the darkening pastures, the ranch house behind them glowing warm with lamplight, Mrs. Purnell's voice audible faintly through the open window. "I don't believe that anymore. I think I came west for a promise that was never truly mine to keep, and found, instead, a place I wasn't looking for at all." Wyatt sat down beside her on the step, close enough that she felt the warmth of him though he did not presume to touch her without invitation. "Margaret, I'll say this plain, the way I say most things, because I've never had much patience for dressing up a true thing in fancier clothes than it needs. I didn't offer you that ride at the depot because I felt sorry for a jilted woman. I offered it because something in your face, even wrecked with grief as it was, struck me the moment I saw it, and every week since has only made that first notion surer. I'm not Everett Bligh, and I won't pretend to be smooth-tongued or well-practiced at this kind of asking. But I'd rather you stayed here as my wife than rode home on that fare your mother sent, if you'd have a plain rancher who's more comfortable with cattle than courting, but who knows exactly what he's asking for and means every word of it." Margaret felt her breath catch, the letter forgotten now in her lap, and looked at this steady, unhurried man who had asked nothing of her for 3 full weeks beyond her own comfort, who had given her shelter and patience, and somewhere in the quiet accumulation of small kindnesses, something that felt far sturdier than the fevered promises Everett Bligh had once made her back east and broken within a single season. "I came 1,000 miles for a ring I never got to wear," she said softly, "from a man who decided, the moment someone prettier arrived, that I wasn't worth the keeping. I think, Wyatt Denholm, that I would very much rather stay here and wear one from a man who decided I was worth it from the very first evening he found me weeping on a depot bench, with nothing left to recommend me but $11 and a broken heart." "You had a good deal more to recommend you than that," Wyatt said, "though I'll grant it took me a small while to say so plainly." "Is that a yes, then?" plainly asked. "That," Margaret said, and found she was smiling through the happy tears standing in her eyes, is most certainly and gladly a yes. She wrote to her mother the following morning, a considerably different letter than the one she'd feared she would have to send, explaining that she would not, after all, be returning east on the fare so carefully saved and sent, but would instead be married that spring to a rancher near Far Junction who had offered her, when she had nothing left in the world to offer in return, a ride, a roof, and in time, a ring freely and rightly earned.